The airlock door closed in my face. I saw her hand on the switch. I saw her eyes. She did not look away like a person who was sorry. She looked away like a person who had already finished thinking about me. Metal sealed.
Air hissed.
My reflection stared back from the small round window, and behind that reflection, the escape pod dropped into the dark with the only person I had been paid to protect. My name is Ethan Cole. 40 seconds earlier, I had been the best-paid bodyguard in this section of the galaxy. Now I was standing on a dying moonbase with one jammed sidearm, a cracked rib, and about 40 people walking toward me who wanted to open me up and see what a human looked like on the inside. Footsteps. Many footsteps. Slow. Almost polite. They were in no hurry, because they thought I had nowhere to go. I looked at the sealed door one more time. Then I looked at my gun. Then I made a decision that would follow me for the next 3 years, like a debt that never stopped collecting interest. I decided I was not going to die quietly. 6 hours earlier, none of this made sense yet. 6 hours earlier, I was standing behind a woman named Keshra Vantel, heir to a crumbling alien throne, in a room full of people who smiled with too many teeth. She had hired me through a contract broker who specialized in what he called delicate placements. I called it babysitting royalty, who did not want to admit they were scared. She barely looked at me when we met, just a glance, top to bottom, the kind you give a chair before you decide whether to sit in it. I am tall for a human, not tall for the room I was standing in. Half the delegates around that summit table had 4 arms or skin like wet stone, or eyes that never blinked, and I stood there in a plain black jacket with a sidearm under my coat, the only creature in the room without some ancient title attached to my name. I did not care about titles. I cared about the paycheck, and about doing my job well enough that nobody ever had a reason to complain. The summit was supposed to be simple. Keshra's empire was losing its grip on 3 border systems, and this meeting was meant to buy time, a treaty, breathing room. I was there to make sure nobody put something sharp into her while she negotiated. I watched the guard captain the whole time. His name was Vex Doran, and something about him made the hair on my arms stand up before my brain caught up with the feeling. He smiled a lot. He smiled at the wrong moments. He smiled when the numbers on the treaty display turned unfavorable for his own princess, and that told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalty actually lived. I told her afterward, in the hallway, quietly, "Watch your captain." She looked at me the way you look at a machine that has started making a strange noise, mildly annoyed, not alarmed. "He has served my family for 11 years, she said. "You have served me for 11 hours. I did not argue. It was not my place, and arguing rarely changes a mind that has already decided you are furniture. 3 hours after that, the lights in the summit hall dropped to half power, and every exit sealed at the same moment, and Vex Doran was suddenly not smiling anymore. He was giving orders. I moved before I understood the full shape of what was happening, because understanding takes time, and time is the one thing you do not get in a moment like that. I grabbed Keshra by the arm and pulled her through a service corridor, while the summit hall behind us filled with weapons fire, and the kind of screaming that does not stop when you want it to. We ran. She was faster than I expected for someone who had never run from anything in her life. The corridor narrowed into a maintenance shaft, and the maintenance shaft opened into a small bay with exactly 1 escape pod, built for 1 passenger, because nobody had planned for a bodyguard to still be standing at the end of this. She looked at the pod. Then she looked at me. I told her to go. I told her I would hold the corridor and find another way out. I was already thinking about the layout, the second bay on the lower deck, the 10 minutes I would need to reach it if I moved fast and got lucky. She stepped into the pod. I turned to check the corridor behind us, because that is the job. Watch the door. Watch the threat. Trust the person you are protecting to do the smart thing while your back is turned. The door closed before I turned back around. I do not know if she hesitated. I never got to ask. All I know is the sound the pod made when it launched, a short mechanical cough, and then the vibration in the floor as her escape carried her away from the moon, and away from me, and away from the 40 armed strangers, now flooding into the corridor behind me, with weapons raised, and faces that had already decided how this would end. Well, hell, I thought. Nobody tells you that in the worst moment of your life, your brain reaches for something almost funny. Mine reached for my boot. My left lace had come undone somewhere in the run, and some small, stupid corner of my mind fixated on it, on the fact that I might die with an untied shoe, and for one absurd second that felt like the most unfair part of the whole situation. Then the first shot came, and the stupid thought vanished, and there was only the corridor and the gun and the math. I am not going to pretend I remember every second of what happened next in perfect order. Fights like that do not organize themselves into a story while they are happening. They come apart into pieces, a shoulder against a wall, a muzzle flash reflected in a helmet visor, the particular sound a body makes when it stops being a threat. What I remember clearly is the counting. I counted shell casings instead of counting bodies, because counting casings felt like housekeeping, and counting bodies felt like something I was not ready to do yet. 7, 12, 19. My hands stayed steady. My breathing stayed even. Something in me had gone very quiet and very practical, the way a machine goes quiet when it is only doing the one thing it was built to do. They kept coming, wave after wave, because whoever was running this operation had not planned for the human bodyguard to still be standing after the princess disappeared into the sky. They had planned for one grieving man to surrender or run. They got neither. Vex Doran found me near the end, in a wide chamber with a cracked ceiling and starlight leaking through the gap. He was breathing hard. His uniform was torn at the shoulder. He looked at what was left of his 40, and then he looked at me, and for the first time all night, he was not smiling. "You should be dead," he said. I told him I got that a lot. He came at me anyway, because pride does strange things to a person who has already lost everything else. I will not describe what happened next in detail. It is enough to say that when it was over, I was the only one still breathing in that chamber, and the starlight kept leaking through the crack in the ceiling like nothing important had happened at all. I sat down on the cold floor for a while. Just sat. My hands would not stop shaking, which struck me as unfair, since they had been perfectly steady while it mattered. I thought about calling for extraction. I had a contact, a retrieval number, a whole chain of people whose job it was to come get contractors out of situations exactly like this one. I did not make the call. Something had shifted in me on that floor. In that quiet, with the starlight and the smell of burned metal, and the sound of my own heartbeat too loud in my ears. I thought about the pod door closing. I thought about her eyes, and how they had not looked sorry, only finished. I decided that whatever I did next, I was not going to do it as somebody's hired shadow anymore. I stripped what gear I could carry, found a working shuttle in the lower bay, and left that moon behind without reporting its coordinates to anyone. Not to the broker, not to any surviving piece of Keshra Vantel's court, not to a single living soul. I did not know yet that leaving quietly would be the loudest decision of my life. I did not know that somewhere out past the edge of charted space, on a rock nobody wanted, a story was about to start growing that would eventually get its own name, whispered in bounty offices and mercenary bars across a dozen systems. They would come to call it a mountain. I only knew, sitting in that stolen shuttle with my hands finally steady again, that I was done being furniture. The engines came online with a low hum, and behind me, the moon shrank into a gray coin against the dark, and somewhere out there, unreachable, uncaring, a princess was flying toward a future she had bought, with a door closing in my face. I pointed the shuttle away from every system with my name on file, and I did not look back either. The stolen shuttle ran out of fuel 3 jumps later, in a system so far from anything important that even the star charts had stopped bothering to name it properly. I put down on a gray moon with thin air and thinner prospects, and for the first week I told myself I was only resting. I was not resting. I was hiding, and some part of me knew it, and some part of me hated knowing it. The listening post had been abandoned for at least a decade before I found it. A squat gray building bolted into rock, built back when some long-gone military wanted eyes on a trade route nobody used anymore. The equipment inside was dead. The generator was not. I got it running on the 3rd day, mostly out of boredom, and that small victory felt bigger than it should have. I told myself I would leave once I figured out where to go. I never left. Word travels strange in the parts of the galaxy where nobody keeps official records. It travels through bar talk and cargo manifests, and the kind of contract brokers who trade rumors the way other people trade currency. Within 2 months, My broker had heard that the human bodyguard hired for the Vantel summit had walked off a moon covered in bodies and vanished. Within 4 months, someone had put a price on my head. I found out about it from Owen Marsh, a fellow contractor who tracked me down not to collect the bounty but to warn me about it. Owen was the kind of man who talked with his hands and laughed too loud at his own jokes, and underneath all that noise, he had the steadiest aim I had ever seen in a human being. "You have got people asking about you in 3 different systems," he told me, sitting across from a table I had built out of scrap metal and stubbornness, and not the kind of asking that ends with flowers. I asked him how much I was worth. "Enough that I thought about it for a whole 10 seconds before I decided I liked you more than I liked money," he said, and laughed at himself, and I found myself laughing too, which surprised me, because I had not laughed since the pod door closed. Owen stayed. He said it was because the listening post had a decent view and terrible company, and he wanted to see which one improved first. I think the real reason was simpler. I think he did not like the idea of one man sitting alone on a rock, waiting for strangers to come kill him, with nobody around to notice if they succeeded. We built the place up together over the following weeks, reinforced the door, rigged sensors out of salvage, turned an abandoned listening post into something that could, if it had to, hold a line. It had to, 6 weeks after Owen arrived. They came in 3 ships, small and fast, the kind built for a quiet job rather than a loud war. I counted 11 bodies, disembarking from the first ship alone, and that was before the other 2 even landed. Owen whistled low beside me, looking through the cracked window at the approaching figures. "Well," he said, "at least they brought enough for both of us." I did not laugh that time. My chest had gone tight and cold, the same tight cold feeling from the moon, from the corridor, from the pod door closing in my face. I recognized it now. It was not fear exactly. It was the feeling right before the part of me that did not stop takes over from the part of me that hopes. We held the post for 6 hours. I am not going to walk through every minute of it, because most of a fight like that is not action. It is waiting, breathing, watching a door, waiting again. The parts people imagine when they hear stories about it later, the parts that get exaggerated into legend, those were maybe 20 minutes total, spread across 6 hours of grinding, ugly, exhausting effort. Owen took a hit near the 4th hour. Not a killing one, but bad enough that his left arm stopped working the way arms are supposed to work, and he kept fighting anyway, favoring his right side, cracking jokes through gritted teeth about how he had 2 arms for a reason, and apparently only needed the backup one after all. By the time the last of the 11 went down, the post looked like it had survived a small war, because it had. Owen sat against the wall, breathing hard, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage on his arm, grinning like an idiot. "Told you the company would improve," he said. I sat down next to him and did not say anything for a long while, because there was nothing funny left in me to say back, and he seemed to understand that, and he let the silence sit there between us without trying to fill it. Word of that fight spread faster than the first rumor had. 11 against 2, and the 2 had walked away. The number on my head climbed. So did the number of people willing to try collecting it. Over the following months, they came in 2s and 3s, testing, probing, the way scavengers test a wounded animal before committing to the kill. Owen and I turned the listening post into something closer to a fortress, patching sensors, laying traps, learning the terrain outside better than the people hunting us ever would. Every group that came, and did not leave the way they arrived. I stopped keeping count around the second dozen. Counting felt like something the old version of me used to do, back when I still thought there was a number that would make sense of any of it. The 8th month brought the first real army. Not a squad, not a strike team. An army, 40 strong, arriving in transports that meant somebody with real resources had finally decided the human hiding on the gray moon was worth a serious investment. I watched them land through the cracked window of the post, and for the first time since the pod door closed, I felt something close to the old fear. Owen stood beside me, his bad arm finally healed enough to hold a weapon properly again. "That is a lot of people," he said, in the flat voice he used when he was more worried than he wanted to admit. I told him it did not matter how many there were. It only mattered how many left standing at the end, and I intended for that number to be 0. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that says a person is trying to memorize something. "You have changed, Ethan," he said quietly. "Since the moon. You know that." I told him I knew. He did not ask me to change back. I think he understood, better than I did at the time, that some doors close the same way that Pod door had closed, and you cannot unseal them just by wishing hard enough. The battle that followed lasted through the night and into the gray light of the next morning. I will say only this about it, because some things do not need every detail spoken aloud to be understood. Owen Marsh did not survive it. He went down defending the eastern approach, the side I had asked him to hold because I trusted no one else to hold it, and by the time I fought my way to him, there was nothing left for me to do but sit with him for the last few minutes and listen to him make one final joke about the view. He said the sunrise over the ridge was better than any he had seen back home. He was smiling when he said it. I buried him myself, outside the post, facing the ridge he had liked so much, and I did not cry, because something in me had gone past crying, months earlier. Somewhere in a corridor full of shell casings I had stopped counting. I finished off the last of the 40 by midday, alone this time, with nobody left to crack jokes or watch my back or remind me there was a version of me that used to laugh easily. After that, I stopped thinking of the listening post as a hiding place. I started thinking of it as a line that anyone who came looking for me would have to cross, and anyone who crossed it would not cross back. The rumors that followed Owen's death did not soften with time, they sharpened. People started calling the rock by a new name in the bars and broker offices where such things get decided without anyone officially voting on it. They stopped saying the listening post. They started saying the mountain, because by then the count of the dead who had tried and failed to take it had grown tall enough to earn the word honestly. I never asked anyone to call it that. Names like that choose themselves, built from enough bodies and enough failed attempts that eventually the story tells itself whether you want it to or not. I kept expecting the flow of hunters to slow down as the reputation grew, the way sensible predators avoid a trap once enough of their kind have died in it. Instead, it kept climbing, because a bounty that keeps getting rejected only makes desperate people more desperate, and desperate people do not always behave sensibly. I stopped leaving the mountain at all after that. I ordered supplies through dead drop channels, paid in scavenged currency and salvage, and let the post become the only place in the galaxy that still knew my name and did not want to end me for it. 3 years passed that way, 3 years of silence between fights, punctuated by violence that never quite managed to reach me, each failed attempt adding another layer to a legend I had never asked for and could not seem to shed. I never said her name during any of it. Not once. Not even alone. Not even in the quiet hours after a fight, when a person's guard drops low enough to let old wounds speak. I told myself that was because her name did not matter anymore. I was lying to myself, and some distant, honest part of me knew it the whole time. A woman named Grace Bennett found the mountain in the 3rd year, and she was the first visitor in a long while who did not come carrying a weapon. I almost shot her anyway, out of habit. She stood at the edge of my sensor range with her hands raised and a small recording device clipped to her collar, shouting up at the post, in a voice that cracked halfway through her own sentence. "I am a journalist," she yelled. "I am not here to kill you." I would very much like to not be killed either, if that is an option you are offering today. I let her in, mostly out of curiosity, and partly because something about the crack in her voice reminded me that fear could still sound human, even after 3 years of forgetting what most human things sounded like. She sat across from the same scrap metal table Owen used to sit at, and for a long moment she just looked around the post, at the reinforced walls, the salvage weapons racked along one side, the dents and scars that told the story of every fight I had stopped counting. "They said this place was a legend," she said finally. I did not expect a legend to look so much like a man who needs a haircut. I asked her why she had come. "Because nobody believes the story," she said. 40 against 1, then 11, then 40 again, and 40 more after that. People tell it like folklore now, 3 systems over, in bars where nobody has ever met a human. I wanted to know how much of it was real. I told her all of it was real, and none of it was interesting, which was the closest thing to a joke I had made in longer than I wanted to admit. She stayed 2 days. In that time she asked more questions than anyone had asked me since the moon, and I answered more of them than I meant to, because there is a particular kind of loneliness that builds up in a person who has spent 3 years talking mostly to himself. and Grace Bennett had a way of listening that made the loneliness feel less permanent for a while. She never once asked about the princess directly. I noticed that. I think she noticed me noticing. On the second night, sitting near the humming generator with 2 cups of something that only loosely qualified as coffee, she finally said the thing she had clearly been building toward the whole visit. "The Vantel Empire is falling apart," she said. "Not slowly anymore. Fast. 3 border systems gone to rebellion, this year alone. Half her court dead or defected. People are saying she will not hold the throne past the year's end." I told her that was not my problem. Grace looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look reporters must practice in a mirror somewhere, patient and unconvinced at the same time. "You built a mountain out of grief, Ethan," she said quietly. "I have interviewed enough soldiers to recognize what this place actually is. It is not a fortress. It is a wound that never got the chance to close, with better security than most." I did not answer that, because there was no good answer, and because some truths land too clean to argue with. She left the next morning, promising not to publish the location of the post, and true to her word, the rumors that followed her visit stayed rumors. No coordinates, no maps, only the growing shape of a story that made careful people avoid the mountain and reckless people seek it out anyway. The reckless kept coming, smaller groups now, mostly, since the larger organizations had learned expensive lessons about what happened to armies sent against this particular rock. But smaller did not mean safer. A single skilled hunter with the right equipment could still get close enough to make a night dangerous, and I fought more of those quiet, nameless skirmishes over the following months than I could ever properly count. I kept the mountain standing. I kept myself standing along with it, though some weeks that felt like the harder of the 2 tasks. Grace came back twice more that year, each time with new information, each time staying a little longer than the visit before. She never brought a weapon. She never asked me to leave. She only brought news, and coffee that never improved, and a kind of company that did not demand anything from the quiet, careful walls I had built around myself. On her 3rd visit, she told me something that made the careful walls crack, just slightly, just enough to let a little cold air through. "Keshra Vantel is alive," she said, watching my face carefully as she said it. "Barely. Her last 2 allied houses turned on her within the same month. She is running with what remains of her personal guard, moving system to system, looking for anyone still willing to shelter her." I told Grace that information did not interest me. Grace smiled, the small, knowing smile of someone who has interviewed enough liars to recognize a bad one. "Of course it does not," she said. "That is why your hand just froze around that cup." I looked down. My hand had, in fact, frozen around the cup. I did not have a clever answer for that, so I did not offer one, and Grace had the decency not to push further, though I could tell from the look in her eyes that she filed the moment away carefully, the way reporters file away everything, for later, for when it might matter. It mattered sooner than either of us expected. 4 months after that 3rd visit, my sensors caught a single ship approaching the mountain, small, unarmed, moving slow and careful in the way of something that expects to be shot at and hopes not to be. I watched it through the cracked window with the same tight, cold feeling I had felt watching the 40 land 3 years earlier, except this feeling had a different shape to it now, something closer to dread mixed with a kind of terrible, unwanted hope. The ship set down at the base of the ridge, well outside my usual kill zone, the way someone lands when they are trying very hard to signal that they mean no harm. A single figure stepped out. Even from a distance, even after 3 years, I knew the shape of her before I could make out a single feature of her face. Some things do not need identifying. Some things are recognized by the body before the mind agrees to catch up. I stood at the window for a long time, not moving, watching her climb the lower path toward the post with careful, deliberate steps, the way a person walks when they know exactly how many ways this could go wrong and have decided to risk it anyway. I thought about not opening the door. I thought about it seriously, for longer than I am proud to admit, standing there with my hand resting on the reinforced frame, listening to my own heartbeat count out seconds I could not seem to spend on any decision at all. 3 years of silence had built something in me that did not want to open that door, something quiet and hard and familiar, the same something that had gotten me through 40 against 1 and 11 against 2, and every fight in between, A version of myself that had learned to survive by not needing anyone, by not wanting anyone, by treating every closed door as final because the first one had been. But my hand moved anyway, slow, almost against my own will, and the reinforced frame slid open, and cold air rushed into the post, along with the sound of her footsteps stopping just outside. She stood there in the doorway, older than I remembered, thinner, a long scar along one side of her jaw that had not been there 3 years ago. Her clothes were plain, travel-worn, nothing like the polished formal wear she had worn at the summit. Whatever crown she still technically held, she was not wearing it now. For a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. The silence stretched out between us, heavy with 3 years of things unsaid, and I found myself doing what I always did in moments like that, reaching for something small and steady to focus on, instead of the enormous thing standing in front of me. My eyes dropped to her boots, caked with dust from the climb, one lace slightly frayed at the end, and some absurd, distant part of my mind noted that detail, and held onto it the way a drowning man holds onto driftwood. "You are alive," she said finally, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, the first crack I had ever heard in it. "Barely your business," I said, and the words came out harder than I meant them to, though not harder than I felt. She flinched, just slightly, and something in me that had spent 3 years building walls felt a small, ugly satisfaction at that flinch, immediately followed by something else, something closer to shame, that I did not examine too closely in that moment. "I have nowhere else to go," she said quietly. "Everyone who was supposed to protect me is dead, or gone. I did not come here because I thought I deserved to be let in." She stopped there, like the rest of the sentence had run out of road. I did not finish it for her. Instead, I stepped back from the doorway, silent, and left the space open behind me, and after a moment's hesitation she stepped through it, into the mountain that grief had built, standing for the first time in 3 years in the same room as the man she had left behind on a dying moon. Neither of us said anything else that night. There was too much to say, and somehow that made it easier to say nothing at all. Morning came the way it always did on the mountain. Gray light through the cracked window, the low hum of the generator, the particular silence of a place built to survive, rather than to welcome. I found Keshra sitting near the humming generator, exactly where Grace used to sit, wrapped in a spare blanket I did not remember offering her the night before. She had not slept, I could tell from the shadows under her eyes, and neither had I, though for entirely different reasons. I made coffee that only loosely qualified as coffee, out of habit more than hospitality, and set a cup down in front of her without a word. She wrapped both hands around it like it was the first warm thing she had held in a long time. "I owe you an explanation," she said, staring into the cup rather than at me. I told her she did not owe me anything, which was a lie, and we both knew it was a lie. But sometimes a lie is the only door wide enough to let a hard conversation through. She told me anyway. "The moment the pod door closed," she said, her voice steady in the careful, practiced way of someone who has rehearsed a confession many times, without ever finding the courage to say it aloud, "I told myself it was strategy. One of us had to survive to warn my court about Vex Doran's betrayal. I told myself you would find another way out, because you always found another way out. In every drill, every simulation, every small crisis in the 11 hours I had known you before that night." I did not answer. I let her keep going, because interrupting a confession is its own kind of cruelty, and I had done enough cruel things to her already, in small, silent ways, over the past 12 hours. "I told myself that story for 3 years, she said. "I told it to my remaining advisors. I told it to the allies who eventually abandoned me anyway. I told it to myself in the dark, on nights when sleep would not come. And it worked, mostly, until I heard the story of the mountain, and understood exactly what surviving that corridor had cost you." Her hands tightened around the cup. "I did not come back because my empire is falling apart," she said. "I came back because I could not carry the story anymore. The lie stopped working the day I heard your name attached to a body count I could not stop imagining." I sat across from her for a long moment, turning her words over the way I used to turn over shell casings, counting them instead of feeling them, because feeling them all at once would have been too much weight for one morning. "You left me to die," I said finally, flat, not cruel, just true. "I did," she said. "I will not pretend otherwise. I do not expect you to forgive it. I only wanted you to hear me say it plainly, once, before whatever happens next happens. Something in my chest that had stayed locked for 3 years shifted. Not open, not yet, but loosened, the way a rusted hinge loosens the first time real pressure gets applied to it after a long time sitting still. I did not tell her it was fine. It was not fine. But I did not send her back out the door either, and for both of us, in that moment, that had to be enough. We spent the rest of the day going over what remained of her situation, and it was worse than even Grace's reports had suggested. Her empire had fractured into competing factions, most of them more interested in claiming pieces of the wreckage than in restoring what had been lost. The handful of loyalists who had stayed with her long enough to get her this far had been picked off one by one over the final leg of the journey, until she arrived at the mountain with nothing but the clothes on her back and a scar along her jaw that she never fully explained. There is a faction led by a woman named Nyla Sten, Keshra said, pulling up what little intelligence she still had access to on a cracked handheld display. She was Vex Doran's second, back at the summit. When he died on that moon, she inherited his ambitions along with his resources. She has spent 3 years consolidating power under my name, while hunting the one loose thread that could still tie her back to that night. I asked what loose thread she meant. Keshra looked up from the display, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was something like real fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for what she was about to say. "You," she said, "you are the only living witness who knows Vex Doran ordered that ambush, and Nyla Sten has spent 3 years funding every bounty that ever came looking for this mountain. She did not want you dead only for revenge. She wanted you dead because you are the last piece of evidence that could unravel everything she has built since." That explained a great deal. It explained why the bounties never stopped climbing, no matter how many failed. It explained why an organization with real resources had been willing to throw army after army at one man on one rock for 3 straight years, long after any sensible cost analysis would have told them to walk away. It also meant that Keshra arriving here, in person, traceable, had just handed Nyla Sten the single opportunity she had been waiting 3 years to get. "I do not think anyone followed me," Keshra said quickly, reading the shift in my expression. "I was careful. I used 3 false transports before this last one." I told her that careful rarely mattered against someone who had spent 3 years building a network specifically designed to notice the one mistake careful people eventually make. She did not argue with that. She just looked down at the cracked display, and for a long moment neither of us said anything, listening to the low hum of the generator and the wind scraping across the ridge outside. "They will come," she said finally, quietly. "And they will come with everything Nyla Sten has left, because she cannot afford to leave either of us alive after this." I told her that people had been coming for 3 years, and the mountain was still standing, and I intended for that to remain true regardless of who was watching from the doorway when the next wave arrived. Something in her expression shifted at that, a small, complicated thing that was not quite gratitude and not quite grief, something in between, something that did not have a clean name. "I am not asking you to protect me again," she said. "I have no right to ask that of you, not after what I did the last time you tried." I told her I was not doing it for her. That was not entirely true, and some tired, honest corner of me knew it. But it was closer to true than anything either of us had said since she walked through that door, and for the moment, it was the only version of the truth I had the strength left to offer. We spent the following days preparing, and preparing together turned out to be its own kind of conversation, one that did not require the hard, careful words from that first morning. She knew things about Nyla Sten's operational patterns that I could never have learned on my own: troop movements, resource allocations, the particular arrogance of a woman who had spent 3 years being underestimated and had grown careless because of it. I knew things about defending this particular rock that no outside intelligence report could have taught her: the blind spots in the ridge, the choke points in the lower approach, the exact angle at which the morning sun made the eastern slope nearly impossible to attack across without being blinded. On the 4th night, sitting near the generator with the same 2 cups of bad coffee between us, she asked me something that had clearly been sitting behind her teeth for days. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Building this, becoming this?" I thought about the question longer than I expected to. I thought about Owen Marsh, buried facing a ridge he liked, and about a corridor full of casings I stopped counting. and about 3 years of silence I had wrapped around myself, like the only armor that ever actually worked. I told her I did not know how to answer that honestly, because the man who might have regretted it had mostly stopped existing somewhere around the second dozen strangers who tried to kill him for money. She did not say anything to that. She only reached across the small distance between us, and rested her hand briefly over mine, not gripping it, not holding on, just resting there, light as a question neither of us was ready to ask out loud. I did not pull away. That was as far as either of us let the moment go, because outside, in the deep quiet beyond the ridge, my sensors had just picked up the first faint signature of ships entering the outer edge of the system. More ships than I had ever tracked approaching the mountain at once, and whatever this moment between us might have become given more time, that time had just run out. Keshra saw the readout over my shoulder and went very still. "That is not a hunting party," she said quietly. I told her I knew. "It is an invasion," she said. I looked at the numbers scrolling across the cracked display, ship after ship after ship, more than the 40 that had taken Owen from me, more than any single wave the mountain had ever faced, and something in my chest went cold and quiet, and very, very steady, the way it always did right before the part of me that did not stop took over completely. I stood up from the table. "Then we had better make sure it is the last one," I said. Keshra rose beside me, and for the first time since the summit hall 3 years ago, she picked up a weapon of her own instead of waiting for someone else to protect her, and together we walked toward the reinforced door of a mountain built entirely out of grief, refusal, and every single person who had ever thought that door would be easy to open. The ships landed at the base of the ridge in a formation too organized to belong to scavengers or bounty hunters chasing easy money. This was a real force, built by someone who had spent 3 years studying every failure that came before it, determined not to repeat a single one of them. I counted the transports from the cracked window, and somewhere around the 6th one I stopped counting, the way I always eventually stopped, because the number stopped mattering once it passed a certain point. What mattered was the ground, the choke points, the angle of the morning sun, all the small advantages 3 years of grief had carved into this particular rock. Keshra stood beside me, weapon in hand, watching the same readout with a stillness I had not expected from her. Whatever fear lived behind her eyes, she kept it folded small and out of the way a person learns to fold fear when there is no room left for it to take up space. "They will try the eastern approach first," she said. "Nyla Sten favors it. Fast terrain, minimal cover, meant to overwhelm through speed rather than caution." I told her that was exactly the approach that had cost Owen his life, and exactly the approach I had spent 3 years reinforcing precisely because of that. She looked at me for a moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and then she nodded, and we moved into position together, the way we had spent the last 4 days planning, 2 people who had once been strangers, standing shoulder to shoulder on a ridge that had swallowed better odds than the ones now walking toward it. The first wave hit the eastern approach exactly as predicted, and exactly as predicted, the terrain did most of the work before either of us fired a single shot. The narrow path funneled them into a line. The morning sun sat low and blinding at their backs, turning their own advance into a disadvantage they had not accounted for. I do not remember every individual moment of what followed. Battles like that do not organize themselves into clean memory. They come apart into fragments, the way the corridor fight had 3 years earlier, except this time there was a second set of hands beside mine. Steady, sure, learning the rhythm of the fight faster than I expected from someone who had spent most of her life behind a summit table instead of behind a weapon. Keshra held the northern gap without flinching, and more than once during that long morning, I caught myself glancing sideways to check on her. Not out of doubt in her ability, but out of an old habit. I thought 3 years of silence had burned out of me completely. It had not. Some habits, it turned out, were simply waiting for a reason to come back. The first wave broke around midday, fewer of them retreating than had arrived, and for a short, strange moment, the ridge went quiet, the kind of quiet that exists only between one violence and the next, heavy and waiting. Keshra found me near the eastern gap, breathing hard, a shallow cut along one arm she had not mentioned until I noticed it myself. "That was the easy part," she said, wrapping a strip of cloth around the cut with hands that only shook slightly. Nyla Sten will not commit her full force until she is certain the terrain has been softened. The real assault comes next. She was right. Within the hour, my sensors picked up the second wave forming at the base of the ridge, larger than the first, moving with the kind of grim patience that belongs to someone who has learned, expensively, not to underestimate this particular rock twice. I found myself thinking, in the strange quiet before that second wave began its climb, about the pod door closing 3 years earlier, about the corridor full of casings, about Owen's last joke about the sunrise, about a version of myself that used to hope things might turn out fine, before that hope got replaced with something harder and more reliable. Keshra's hand found mine again, briefly, the same light, questioning touch from the night by the generator. "Whatever happens next," she said quietly, "I am not leaving through a door without you again." I did not have a clever answer for that. I only nodded, once, and the second wave began its climb, and whatever answer either of us might have given the moment, more time got buried under the immediate, urgent business of staying alive. The second wave was worse than the first, longer, harder, spread across more of the ridge than a single pair of defenders should reasonably have been able to hold. There were moments during that fight where I genuinely did not know if we would still be standing at the end of it. Moments where the only thing keeping my hands steady was the same old trick, fixing on something small and stupid, instead of the enormous weight of the thing actually happening. I fixed on the frayed lace of Keshra's boot, glimpsed once during a brief pause between exchanges, and something about that small, ordinary detail kept me anchored through the worst of it. The way a single loose thread can hold an entire unraveling sweater together, slightly longer than it has any right to. Nyla Sten herself arrived near the end of the second wave, flanked by a personal guard, smaller than the forces she had already spent, which told me everything about how confident she had been that the numbers alone would finish the job before she needed to risk herself directly. She found us on the ridge near the reinforced door, and for a long moment the fighting around us seemed to fade into background noise, the way it does when the actual point of a battle finally steps into view. "You are more trouble than any single human has any right to be," she said, looking at me with an expression that was not quite hatred, something colder and more calculating than that. I told her that people kept telling me that, and none of them had managed to do anything about it yet. She looked past me to Keshra, and something in her expression shifted, the first real crack of uncertainty I had seen from her since she arrived. "You could have stayed hidden," she said to Keshra. "Your empire was already mine in every way that mattered. I would have let you live out the rest of your life somewhere quiet, forgotten, harmless. Instead you came here, to this, and now neither of us leaves this ridge the way we arrived." Keshra's voice, when it came, was steadier than I had heard it since she stepped through the reinforced door 4 days earlier. "I did not come back to reclaim a throne," she said. "I came back because I owed a debt I should have paid 3 years ago, and I intend to finish paying it today, whatever that costs either of us." What followed after that, I am not going to describe in detail, because some things do not need every moment spoken aloud to be understood, and because the ending of it matters far more than the mechanics that got us there. It is enough to say that when the ridge finally went quiet again, properly quiet, the kind of quiet that does not carry the promise of a third wave behind it, Nyla Sten's ambitions ended on the same ground that had already swallowed 3 years of everyone else's. Keshra stood beside me in the wreckage of it, breathing hard. Blood and dust streaked across clothes that had never been built for this kind of work, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all, the way neither of us had said anything on that first night, except this silence felt different, lighter somehow, like a held breath finally allowed to leave the body. The sun was setting over the ridge by the time the last of it was truly over, painting the whole rocky slope the same gray-gold color Owen used to say he liked so much, and I found myself standing there, looking at that color, thinking about a joke about sunrises made by a man who never got to see this particular one. Keshra came to stand beside me, following my gaze toward the ridge, and after a long moment she spoke, quiet, careful, like she understood without being told exactly what I was looking at and why. "He would have liked this view too," she said. I told her he would have. We stood there a while longer, not talking, just watching the light change over ground that had cost so much to hold, and something in my chest that had stayed locked and cold for 3 years finally, fully unclenched, not gently, Not with relief exactly, but with something close to it. Something familiar and sharp and steady. The same feeling I used to reach for in the worst moments. Except this time, it did not feel like armor. It felt like the first honest thing I had felt in 3 years. I did not tell Keshra that I forgave her. I am not sure I did. Not fully. Not yet. And I have never been in the business of saying things I do not mean, simply because a moment seems to call for them. But I did not send her away either, and when she finally turned to look at me, waiting, uncertain, still carrying 3 years of guilt behind her eyes, I found myself reaching for something steadier than an answer, something that did not need words yet to mean exactly what it needed to mean. The mountain stood quiet behind us as the light faded, a place built entirely out of grief and refusal, now holding, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not quite peace, but was close enough to it, that neither of us felt any particular hurry to name it anything else. Somewhere out past the ridge, the galaxy would keep telling its story about the mountain of assassins and the human who never stopped standing on it. They would not know the rest of it. They would not know about Owen's sunrise, or the frayed lace on a boot, or a hand resting light and uncertain across a table with 2 cups of bad coffee between them. Some stories, I had learned, were better left unfinished for anyone but the 2 people who actually lived them. I picked up what remained of my gear, and Keshra fell into step beside me, and together we walked back toward the reinforced door of a place that had never once, in 3 long years, let either of us down.